Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Mark Davis, a 23-year-old law student, was feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. With his father's debts hanging over him, he was struggling to keep his head above water. Juggling school, a part-time job, and the constant fear of losing his family's home, Mark had reached the breaking point. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was an unexpected call, one that would change the course of his life. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you." "It's regarding your financial situation," the voice on the other end of the line said, calm and firm. Mark frowned, confused. "Sorry, who is this?" he asked. "I know about your debts," Eleanor replied, her voice smooth. "I know you're barely scraping by. Meet me at Brooks Bistro, 7:00 p.m. It's important." The call ended before Mark could protest. Mark stood still for a moment, the silence ringing in his ears. He had no idea who Eleanor Brooks was, but the mention of his financial troubles was enough to make him wonder how much this stranger knew. He had no choice but to go, so he threw on his jacket and headed out into the rain. As Mark walked to the bistro, he couldn't shake the unease that settled in his stomach. The rain poured heavily, soaking through his jacket, but the thought of his family's situation made him press on. He arrived at the bistro, drenched and shivering, and was immediately greeted by a woman sitting at a corner table. Eleanor Brooks. She was striking, her silver hair perfectly styled, her sharp suit a far cry from Mark's wet, worn clothes. "Mr. Davis," she said, motioning for him to sit down. Her voice was calm, authoritative, and there was no hint of warmth. "I know you're struggling. I can help." Mark sat down across from her, trying to hide his nervousness. He didn't know what to expect, but it certainly wasn't this. Eleanor continued, her gaze never wavering. "I've been following your situation for a while. Your father's debts are more than you can handle on your own. I'm here to offer you a solution, a way out." Mark listened closely, his mind racing. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice tight. "Marriage," she replied, without hesitation. "Marry me, Mark. It's a business arrangement. I'll pay off all your debts, secure your financial future, and in return, you'll be my husband. There's no love involved. Just a simple agreement." Mark blinked, disbelief clouding his thoughts. "Are you serious?" he asked, still struggling to process what she had just said. "Why me? You don't even know me." Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I don't need love, Mark. I need a companion, someone to share my name, my legacy. You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this." Mark's mind was spinning. The offer was outrageous, and yet it wasn't entirely without merit. He needed the money, desperately. His family needed him. And Eleanor seemed to have the means to make everything disappear. "I can't," Mark said, shaking his head. "This is insane." But Eleanor's steady gaze never faltered. "You don't have to decide right now," she said calmly. "Take your time. But remember, this opportunity won't be available forever." With that, she stood up, leaving Mark to consider her proposal. As she walked out of the bistro, Mark was left alone with his thoughts, torn between his pride and his desperation. As Mark walked home in the pouring rain, he couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor's offer. The weight of his family's debt and the uncertainty of the future pressed down on him, making him feel like there was no way out. His mother's health was deteriorating, his younger sister's tuition was piling up, and Mark was sinking deeper into debt with each passing day. When he arrived home, he found his mother sitting at the kitchen table, her tired eyes watching him as he entered. He sat down beside her, the tension in his chest growing with every second. "I don't know what to do, Mom," Mark admitted, his voice strained. He explained Eleanor's offer, his doubts, and his fears. His mother's voice was soft but firm as she spoke. "You may not want to marry her, Mark, but if she can help us, maybe it's worth considering. You don't need to do it for love, you're doing it to save our family." Mark stared at his hands, torn between his pride and his responsibility. Could he really marry a stranger for the sake of his family? He didn't know, but the pressure was building. He couldn't afford to let them down. The next day, Mark returned to the bistro. Eleanor was already waiting for him. "Have you decided?" she asked, her voice as businesslike as ever. Mark hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. Finally, he sighed, his resolve hardening. "I'll do it." Eleanor's eyes sparkled with approval as she smiled faintly. "Good," she said. "The arrangements will be made immediately. I'll take care of everything." Mark's life had just changed forever, but he had no idea what was waiting for him on the other side of this decision. Stay tuned for more of this surprising story. What happens next will leave you speechless. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Mark Davis, a 23-year-old law student, was carrying a burden he couldn't shake. His father's debts weighed heavily on him. Juggling school, a part-time job, and the constant fear of losing his family's home, Mark felt as though his life was spiraling out of control. His phone buzzed, cutting through his thoughts. It was an unexpected call, one that would soon change his life. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation," the voice on the other end said, her tone calm but firm. Mark frowned, confused. "Sorry, who is this?" he asked. "I know about your debts," Eleanor replied smoothly. "I know you're barely making ends meet. Meet me at Brooks Bistro, 7:00 p.m. It's important." The call ended before Mark could protest. Mark was left staring at the phone, his mind racing. How did she know? Who was she? He had no choice but to go. With his heart heavy, he made his way to the bistro. He arrived, drenched in the rain, and saw a woman sitting at a corner table. Eleanor Brooks. She was striking, with her perfectly styled silver hair and tailored suit. Everything about her screamed power and control, and Mark felt instantly out of place. "Mr. Davis," she greeted him, gesturing for him to sit. Her voice was sharp and authoritative. "I know what you're going through. I can help." Mark sat down, unsure of where this conversation would lead. He had no idea what to expect, but this woman seemed to know far more about him than he was comfortable with. "You've been struggling," Eleanor continued. "I've been following your situation for some time now. Your father's debts are more than you can handle on your own. I'm offering you a way out. I can solve your financial problems." Mark was taken aback. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "Marriage," she said without hesitation. "Marry me, Mark. It's a business arrangement. I'll pay off your debts, secure your future. In return, you'll be my husband. There's no love involved. Just a simple agreement." Mark stared at her, speechless. "You want me to marry you?" Just like that? Yes, she said, her tone steady. I don't need love. I need a companion, someone to share my name, my legacy. You're young, unattached, and, frankly, desperate enough to accept this offer. You'll help me, and I'll help you. Mark was stunned. Marrying a stranger, just for the sake of money? But as he thought about his mother's health, his sister's tuition, and the constant pressure of his father's debts, he realized that maybe he didn't have a choice. I can't, Mark said, shaking his head. This is crazy. You don't have to decide now, Eleanor said. But don't take too long. This offer won't be available forever. Mark sat in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Could he really marry a stranger? Was there any other way? He didn't know, but the thought of failing his family was unbearable. Mark left the bistro that night, his thoughts in turmoil. The rain had stopped, but the weight of Eleanor's proposal hung heavily on his shoulders. He had never imagined that something as simple as a marriage contract could become the answer to all his problems. But could he really go through with it? Could he marry a stranger for the sake of his family? As he walked through the quiet streets, his mind replayed the conversation over and over. Eleanor's calm, unwavering gaze had haunted him, her offer still echoing in his ears. Marry me, Mark. It's a business arrangement. The words felt surreal, almost too good to be true, yet everything about the situation screamed desperation. At home, Mark found his mother waiting in the kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound filling the silence. She looked up as he entered, her tired eyes meeting his. Mark had never felt more like a failure. His family's financial situation had been spiraling for months, and he knew his mother's health was deteriorating faster than he could keep up with the bills. He took a deep breath before sitting down beside her. I met with Eleanor Brooks, he said quietly, the words leaving his lips like they were part of a dream. His mother's eyes widened, though she said nothing at first. She had heard of Eleanor Brooks, the wealthy CEO who had built her fortune from the ground up, and she knew the power and influence the woman held. Mark continued, his voice strained. She made me an offer, Mom. She wants me to marry her. It's a business deal. She'll pay off all our debts. She'll secure our future. But it's not for love. It's just an arrangement. Mark's mother stared at him, her face unreadable. Marry her? She asked after a long pause. You don't love her, do you? Mark shook his head. No, Mom. I don't even know her. But she's offering to fix everything. The debt, the bills, everything. I don't know what else to do. He ran his hand through his hair, frustration and confusion boiling inside him. I'm stuck, Mom. I can't keep living like this. I don't want to lose everything. His mother looked down, her hands trembling as she folded the napkin in her lap. You've always been a good son, Mark, she said softly. But this is a big decision. I don't want you to do something you'll regret, but if this offer can save us, maybe you don't have a choice. Her voice cracked, the weight of her words hitting Mark harder than he expected. Mark closed his eyes, feeling the burden of it all press against his chest. He wanted to say no. He wanted to tell Eleanor that this wasn't the way to solve their problems. But deep down, he knew he didn't have another option. He had to think about his family, about the people who were relying on him. I'll go back to her, he said finally, his voice firm but tinged with uncertainty. I'll do it for us. The next morning, Mark stood outside Brooks' Bistro again, his heart racing as he watched the restaurant's elegant facade. The decision had been made, but the reality of what he was about to do still felt foreign, like he was walking into someone else's life. He didn't know what to expect, but he had to see it through. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. Eleanor was already waiting for him, sitting at the same table where they had met the night before. She didn't look up when he entered, but she spoke, her voice calm and collected. You've made your decision, she said, her eyes finally meeting his. There was no surprise in her gaze, only a quiet confidence. She had known he would come back. She had known all along. Mark nodded, his throat tight. Yes, he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the decision. I'll marry you. I'll do it. Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Good, she replied simply. The arrangements will be made immediately. I'll take care of everything. We'll need to draw up a contract. It will outline everything clearly, and then we can proceed. Mark felt a wave of unease wash over him. He had thought he was prepared for this, but now that the decision was real, it felt like too much. This wasn't just about saving his family anymore. This was about his future, about everything he had worked for, everything he had dreamed of. He was giving up his freedom, his dignity, all for the sake of a promise from a stranger. I'll sign the contract, he said, his voice quiet. But what happens after? What do I do once this is over? Will it be just like you said, no emotions, no love? Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her eyes hard to read. I can't promise you anything beyond what we've agreed on, she said, her tone final. This is a business arrangement, Mark. It's simple. It's clean. But the choice is yours. You can walk away if you want. But understand this is your opportunity to fix everything. Mark took a deep breath, the weight of her words sinking in. He had already made the decision. There was no turning back now. He had to go through with it. He had to marry her, and he had to make sure that his family's future was secure, no matter what it cost him. Stay tuned for what happens next. Will this business arrangement turn into something more, or will Mark's decision lead to consequences he never expected? The days that followed were a blur for Mark. The decision had been made, and now he had to live with it. Eleanor wasted no time. The contract was drawn up and signed within the week, a cold, legal document that outlined every detail of their arrangement. There would be no romantic expectations, no personal entanglements, just two people bound by a business agreement. Mark's role was clear: husband in name only. The rest of his life would be untouched by emotion. Mark stood in the grand foyer of Eleanor's estate, feeling completely out of place. The marble floors gleamed beneath his feet, and the walls were adorned with art that spoke of wealth beyond his comprehension. He had never seen anything like this. Eleanor had already moved him into one of the guest rooms, a luxurious suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked perfectly manicured gardens. It was a far cry from his cramped apartment and the dingy room he had grown up in. But despite the luxury, he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong here. It was the evening of their wedding. The ceremony had been small, quiet, with only a handful of people in attendance: Eleanor's lawyer, her business associates, and a few close friends. No family, no celebrations, no joy. Just the signing of vows, sealing the deal. Eleanor had been calm and composed throughout the entire thing, but Mark noticed something else: a hint of loneliness in her eyes. Despite the wealth and power she held, there was a deep emptiness that no amount of money could fill. Mark couldn't help but feel sympathy for her. Eleanor had always been so direct, so businesslike, but as the days passed, he began to see that there was more to her than just the cold exterior. In private moments, when the weight of their arrangement was forgotten, Eleanor would share small glimpses of vulnerability, like when she asked him how his family was doing, or when she spoke briefly of her past, about how she had built her empire from the ground up, alone. There were no happy memories to look back on, no love, only ambition and isolation. Despite the lack of emotional connection, Mark found himself spending more time with Eleanor. They had agreed that they would attend public events together as husband and wife, but the more time they spent together, the more Mark noticed subtle changes in their relationship. Eleanor, while still distant, began to show him more kindness. He had never expected this to be anything other than a cold, transactional arrangement, but as they sat across from each other at lavish dinners or walked through the gardens in silence, he started to wonder, was it possible for something real to develop between them? One evening, after a particularly exhausting gala, Mark found himself sitting on the edge of the bed in his guest room, staring out the window at the city lights and the distance. He had just returned from another public appearance with Eleanor, her arm around his as if they were the perfect couple. But he couldn't stop thinking about how disconnected he felt. Was he really just going to go through life pretending? Was this all there was to their marriage? As he sat there lost in thought, the door to his room opened. Eleanor stepped inside, her face tired but soft. "I know you're not happy with this," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "But I'm doing what I can to make it work for both of us." Mark looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of the situation. He had no idea what was happening between them, but he knew one thing for sure: Eleanor wasn't the cold, ruthless woman she appeared to be. There was something more inside her, something he hadn't expected to find in this arrangement. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Eleanor sat down beside him, her posture rigid but her eyes softer than before. "I never wanted this life for myself," she said, her voice barely audible. "I thought that building an empire would be enough, but now, I realize it's not. I don't have anyone to share it with, no one to trust." Mark turned to her, his mind racing. "Eleanor, you don't have to keep doing this alone," he said softly. "I'm here. I don't know what this is, but I'm here." She looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time, Mark saw a flicker of something in her eyes: vulnerability, maybe even hope. But she quickly looked away, standing up and smoothing her dress. "This wasn't supposed to be about emotions, Mark." "We agreed." Mark nodded slowly, feeling a pang in his chest. He had agreed, but somewhere along the way, he had started to care. And as much as he hated to admit it, so had she. The next few days were a blur of meetings and public appearances. But even though they continued to go through the motions of their arrangement, something had shifted between them. Eleanor was still distant, but there was a subtle warmth in her actions, a quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. Mark wasn't sure what to make of it. Was this just part of the deal? Or was something more beginning to form between them? He didn't know, but for the first time since agreeing to the marriage, he allowed himself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something real after all. Stay tuned for what happens next. Will Mark and Eleanor's business arrangement turn into something deeper, or will their emotional walls prove too strong to break? Mark and Eleanor's arrangement had started to settle into a strange routine. Every morning, they would meet in the grand dining room for breakfast, exchanging polite conversation about work and other trivial matters. But despite the coldness of their interactions, something subtle had shifted between them. Eleanor's smile was no longer reserved for public appearances. Mark had caught glimpses of it in private, too. Still, there was a distance between them that neither of them had crossed yet. Eleanor continued to keep her walls high, as if afraid to let anyone in, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that she was starting to trust him in ways she hadn't before. It was one evening after a high-profile charity gala that Mark found himself questioning everything. The event had been flawless, as expected. They had played their roles to perfection: Mark as the dutiful husband, Eleanor as the powerful CEO. But as they walked to the car afterward, Mark couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that had been growing inside him. He had promised himself that this arrangement was only temporary, that he would endure the facade for the sake of his family. But the more time he spent with Eleanor, the more complicated his feelings became. Was this still just a business arrangement? Or had it started to feel like something more? As the car rolled through the quiet streets, Eleanor remained silent, her face illuminated by the passing streetlights. Mark watched her, unsure of how to address the tension that had begun to fill the space between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice tentative. "Eleanor, do you ever wonder if we're doing the right thing?" She turned to him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Mark thought she might dismiss the question, but instead, she seemed to consider it. "Doing the right thing?" she repeated softly. "What does that mean, Mark?" "We agreed on this. I'm keeping my end of the deal. I don't know what else there is to wonder about." Mark couldn't help but notice the faint sadness in her voice, the way her eyes seemed to soften for a second before she quickly masked it. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes, I just feel like we're not being honest with ourselves." There was a long pause. Eleanor turned her gaze back to the road, her jaw clenched, as though she was fighting an inner battle. I don't have time for honesty, she said, her voice cool, but Mark could hear the underlying tension. I built my empire on lies, Mark. Sometimes, the truth is just a luxury I can't afford. Mark's heart tightened. He had never heard her speak so openly about her past, and he realized that he knew very little about her beyond the businesswoman everyone saw. He wanted to reach out, to say something to break down the walls she had so carefully constructed around herself. But he didn't know how. They arrived at the mansion in silence, the car pulling into the long driveway. Eleanor stepped out first, her heels clicking sharply against the stone as she made her way inside. Mark followed, still lost in thought. He had thought that accepting the contract would be the hard part, but now he realized that living with her was the real challenge. Inside, the mansion was quiet, and the familiar luxury felt cold and empty. Eleanor headed straight for the staircase, but Mark stopped in the hallway, watching her. He had promised to stay emotionally distant, to keep his feelings in check. But the more time he spent with her, the harder that became. Eleanor, Mark called, his voice hesitant. She stopped at the base of the stairs, her back to him. I need to ask you something. She turned to face him, her expression guarded. What is it? Mark took a deep breath, gathering his courage. I don't know if I can keep doing this, the distance, the pretending. I'm not asking for love, but I can't keep going like this either. Can we at least be real with each other? I'm not asking for a perfect marriage, but can we have something more than just a contract? Eleanor stood there for a moment, her eyes studying him, as if weighing his words. For the first time, Mark saw something flicker behind her usual composure, of vulnerability that she had never shown before. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than he expected. You don't get it, do you? This isn't about what we feel. It never was. I needed someone, Mark. I needed someone I could trust, someone who wouldn't ask for more than what I was willing to give. This arrangement, it's easier for me that way. I don't have to feel anything. I don't have to care. Her words cut through him like a knife. He had known that she had kept herself closed off, but hearing her admit it so bluntly made his chest ache. He had always known she was emotionally distant, but he hadn't realized just how much she had shut herself off from everyone. Was he really just another person to use for her benefit, or was there something more to their connection? Mark stepped closer, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I don't think I can do this anymore. I'm not asking for everything, Eleanor, but I'm asking for something real. I want to get to know you. I want to see who you really are. There was a long silence as Eleanor looked at him, her face softening just a little. For the first time, she didn't look like the powerful CEO who always had everything under control. She looked human. And in that moment, Mark realized something that took him by surprise. He wasn't just fighting for his family anymore. He was fighting for her. Stay tuned for what happens next. Will Eleanor let her guard down, or will Mark's plea be in vain? The next morning, things felt different. The atmosphere between Mark and Eleanor had shifted, though neither of them knew exactly how to navigate the change. After their conversation the night before, Eleanor had left Mark standing there, still processing what had just happened. She had given him a look, something vulnerable, something raw that he couldn't forget. But as the day wore on, they fell back into their routine, the walls between them firmly back in place. Neither of them knew how to move forward, but the distance between them had never felt so palpable. At breakfast, Eleanor sat across from Mark, her expression cool and controlled. She wasn't the powerful CEO who commanded attention in boardrooms anymore, not in that moment. She was just a woman, sitting across from him, her eyes avoiding his. Mark felt the weight of the silence between them. He wanted to reach out, to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. Every time he tried to bridge the gap between them, she pulled further away. Mark couldn't ignore the tension that had been building for days. He had promised himself he would keep his emotions in check, that this arrangement was just business. But he had found himself questioning that promise every time he looked at her. The idea of living the rest of his life in a marriage that was nothing more than a contract felt suffocating. And the worst part? He was starting to feel something for Eleanor. Something real. But she was still so guarded, so closed off. How could he break through? It was later that evening, after another exhausting round of meetings and events, that Mark finally couldn't take it anymore. He found Eleanor in her office, alone, staring out the large window that overlooked the city. The lights of the skyline twinkled, but there was a coldness in the room that Mark could feel in his bones. Eleanor didn't hear him enter at first. She was lost in her thoughts, her gaze distant. But when she turned and saw him standing in the doorway, her expression softened just slightly. It was a moment of vulnerability, a crack in the armor she had built around herself. Mark knew this was his chance. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Eleanor," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. She didn't respond immediately, but she didn't look away either. "We can't keep doing this. This pretending. We've both been living a lie, and it's eating away at me." Eleanor's lips parted, but she didn't speak. Her eyes were full of emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: fear, regret, longing. She had built a life where she didn't need anyone. A life where emotions were a luxury she couldn't afford. But now, standing here in front of Mark, she was beginning to question that. Was it too late to open her heart? Mark continued, taking a step closer, his voice breaking through the silence. "I don't know what we have, Eleanor. But I can't live like this anymore. I need more than just a contract. I need you. And I need to know if you can give me that. Or if I'm just wasting my time hoping for something real." Eleanor's eyes searched his, but she said nothing at first. Her face was a mask of indecision, torn between what she wanted and what she feared. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke, her voice low but sincere. Mark stepped closer, his heart pounding. "It's okay," he said gently. "We can figure this out. But I can't keep pretending that this is just business. I need more than that. We both deserve more than that." For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. She just stood there, her face conflicted. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to make Mark's heart race. He had made a choice, and now Eleanor was finally making hers. They stood there for a long moment, the silence between them thick with unspoken words, but there was a quiet understanding. Eleanor had let down her guard, just a little, and in that moment, Mark saw her for the first time not as the cold CEO, but as a woman who had been hurt, who had built walls around herself for protection. He didn't know where this was going, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to walk away. As the night went on, they shared a quiet dinner together, the atmosphere between them more relaxed than it had ever been. They didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was comfortable, as if the distance between them was finally starting to fade. Eleanor still wasn't ready to admit how she felt, but Mark could see the subtle changes in her. She was starting to let him in, just a little. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Mark didn't know what the future held for them, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that there could be something real between them. Something that went beyond the contract, beyond the business deal. Stay tuned for the next chapter. Will their fragile connection turn into something more? Or will the walls they've built around their hearts be too strong to break down? The following days were a quiet turning point in Mark and Eleanor's relationship. The routine they had settled into began to feel less like a cold business arrangement and more like something else, something unspoken but real. Their conversations, once strictly professional, began to branch out into more personal territory. They shared stories, their likes and dislikes, their past, things they had never thought to share before. But despite the small steps they were taking toward each other, the walls still existed. Eleanor wasn't ready to fully let go, not yet. She had spent so long guarding her heart that it was hard to believe anything could change. But Mark was patient. And for the first time, he saw cracks in her armor. One evening, Eleanor came home from a long day at work, looking more exhausted than usual. She dropped her bag by the door and stood still for a moment, her back to Mark, as if gathering herself. Mark, who had been reading in the living room, set his book aside and stood up. "You okay?" he asked softly. It was a simple question, but one he had begun to ask more often lately. Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes tired but warm, a rare softness in her gaze. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice a little hoarse. "Just a long day. I'm not used to this constant rush." She paused and took a deep breath, as if trying to shake off the stress that had built up over the day. "I've been so focused on building everything, I didn't think about what I was missing." Mark raised an eyebrow, curious. "What do you mean?" he asked. He had never heard her speak like this before, and he wanted to understand. Eleanor hesitated, then walked over to the window, staring out at the city lights in the distance. "I've spent so much of my life building this empire. I thought I had everything figured out. But now, I'm starting to realize that maybe I've built it on the wrong thing. Maybe I've been so focused on what I can control that I lost sight of what I really needed." And now she turned to face him, her voice quieter. "Now I don't know how to fix it." Mark felt a pang of empathy for her. He knew what it felt like to be stuck in a life that wasn't really yours, to be carrying the weight of expectations and responsibilities. He crossed the room to stand beside her, offering a reassuring smile. "It's not too late, Eleanor," he said softly. "You don't have to do it alone. You've been building this empire, but maybe it's time to let someone in. You're not meant to carry all of this by yourself." For a moment, Eleanor just looked at him, as if weighing his words. She had always been the one in control, the one who made all the decisions. But Mark's words seemed to break through the fortress she had built around herself. She had spent so much time convincing herself that she didn't need anyone, that she didn't want anyone, but now, with Mark standing beside her, something shifted. Maybe she didn't need to carry everything alone. "I don't know how to trust," she admitted quietly. "I've been hurt before, Mark. It's easier to keep people at arm's length than to risk letting them in." Mark nodded, understanding more than she realized. "I get that. But sometimes, you have to take a chance. Trust doesn't happen overnight, but it can happen. You don't have to do everything on your own. I'm here." Eleanor looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel so alone. The walls around her heart were still there, but they were no longer as impenetrable. She wasn't sure what this was between them, but she was starting to realize that maybe it was worth exploring. Over the next few days, Eleanor began to open up in small ways. She shared more of her past with Mark, her childhood, her early struggles in building her business, and even her fears about being vulnerable. Mark listened, his heart softening as he realized just how much pain she had been hiding. They weren't in love not yet, but something was growing between them, something genuine, something real. One night, after a long week of work and public events, they sat together in the living room, talking about everything and nothing. Eleanor had changed into comfortable clothes, her hair loosely tied back, and for the first time, she looked at ease. She smiled at Mark, a rare and soft smile that made his heart skip. "I never thought I'd be sitting here like this," she said, her voice light. "But somehow, it doesn't feel so bad." Mark smiled back, feeling a warmth inside him that he hadn't felt in a long time. "I'm glad," he replied softly. "It's nice, isn't it? Not pretending for a change." They sat in companionable silence, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows on the walls. Eleanor wasn't ready to admit how she was feeling, but Mark could see the change in her. She was letting him in, little by little. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And for the first time, Mark felt like this could turn into something more. Something real. Stay tuned for the next part of their story. Will Eleanor continue to let her guard down, or will the past hold her back? The days after their quiet conversation seemed to stretch out slowly, as if time itself was holding its breath. Mark noticed that Eleanor was becoming less guarded, less distant. She smiled more often, and although she still kept her personal life private, she no longer shied away from his questions or attempts at connection. For the first time, he felt that maybe their arrangement was becoming something more than just a business deal. But he wasn't the only one feeling the change. Eleanor, though still cautious, was slowly starting to soften, letting Mark into a part of her life she had kept closed off for so long. One afternoon, they were both in the living room, working on separate projects. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of the wind outside. Mark glanced up from his work and caught Eleanor looking out the window, her expression thoughtful. He noticed how different she seemed now, more relaxed, less the cold CEO he had first met. There was a vulnerability to her that he hadn't seen before, and it made him want to reach out, to show her that she didn't have to face everything alone. "Eleanor," Mark said softly, breaking the silence. She turned to look at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "Do you ever think about what comes next? After all of this?" She hesitated, as if unsure of what he meant. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice cautious but not as guarded as it once had been. Mark set his laptop aside and stood up, walking over to where she was sitting. "I mean, after we've gotten through everything, after the debts are cleared, after the contract is finished, what happens then? Where do we go from here?" Eleanor's gaze softened, and she looked down at her hands. She wasn't sure how to answer. She had built her entire life on control, on having a plan for every moment. But Mark's question was different. It was about something she hadn't allowed herself to think about: a future without walls, a future where she might be able to let someone in. "I don't know," she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always had a plan, Mark. I've always known what to do next. But now I don't know. I don't know if I'm ready for anything beyond this. Beyond what we have." Mark took a deep breath, stepping closer. He didn't push her for an answer. He understood that she had been hurt before, that her past had shaped who she was today. But something in him couldn't help but hope. "Eleanor, I know this hasn't been easy for you. And I know you're not ready to jump into anything, but I can't help but think that maybe we could have something real. Not just a contract. Not just a marriage for convenience. Something more." Eleanor met his gaze then, her eyes searching his. There was a moment of silence, a moment where the walls between them seemed to fade. She could feel the sincerity in his words, and for the first time, she wondered if maybe she had been wrong to keep everyone out. But it was easier said than done. Letting someone in meant risking everything, and she wasn't sure she could bear that again. She looked away, her voice soft but firm. "I don't know, Mark. I don't know if I'm ready for that. I've spent so long building walls, protecting myself from getting hurt. I don't know if I can just let them all come down." Mark took a step closer, his voice steady but filled with warmth. "I'm not asking for everything, Eleanor. I'm not asking you to change overnight. I just want to be here for you. No expectations. Just us. Whatever that looks like." Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She stood there, looking at him as if she was seeing him in a new light. He wasn't asking for her to open up all at once. He wasn't trying to change her. He was offering her the one thing she had never allowed herself to have: someone who truly cared for her, someone who wanted to be by her side, no matter what. After a long pause, Eleanor finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can do that, Mark. But maybe I'll try. I'm not promising anything. But I'll try." Mark's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. And for the first time, he felt like there was a chance for something real between them, something that went beyond the contract they had signed, something that could turn into love. They stood there for a moment, the air between them charged with a quiet understanding. They didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, they were facing it together. Whatever happened next, they would face it as partners. Stay tuned for the next chapter of their story. Will Eleanor continue to open her heart, or will the past pull her back into her old ways? The following days felt like a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. Mark and Eleanor continued their lives, the routine of public appearances and business meetings unchanged, but the subtle shift between them was undeniable. Eleanor, once closed off, had started to let her guard down just a little. She was still reserved, still cautious, but the walls she had built around herself were no longer as impenetrable. Mark could see it, could feel it in the way she spoke to him, in the way she no longer pulled away when he reached out to help her. They weren't in love, not yet, but something real was starting to take root. One evening, as they both sat in the living room, their work done for the day, Eleanor seemed more at ease than she had been in a long time. The evening had turned quiet, the only sound coming from the soft hum of the city outside. Mark was sitting across from her, his eyes on his phone, but he could feel her attention on him, just like he could feel the pull between them. For a moment, he wondered if she could feel it too, the change in the air, the shift in the space between them. Finally, Eleanor put her phone down and looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Mark," she said softly, breaking the silence. "I've been thinking." She hesitated, as if unsure of how to continue, but then took a deep breath. "You're right, we've been living like this for so long, and maybe it's time we stop pretending. But I don't know how to move past all of this. It's not easy for me." Mark set his phone down, his gaze never leaving hers. "You don't have to move past it all at once," he said, his voice gentle. "We don't have to have all the answers right now. I just want to be here, Eleanor. I want to see where this can go, even if it's slow. We don't have to rush." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. She was quiet, lost in her thoughts, but Mark could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the openness she hadn't shown before. "It's not that simple," she said quietly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I've spent my entire life building walls. I've been burned before, and I don't know if I'm ready to tear those walls down. I don't know if I can." Mark stood up, walking over to where she was sitting. He knelt in front of her, his eyes locked on hers. "You don't have to tear them down all at once. I'm not asking for that," he said softly. "I'm just asking that you let me in, just a little. That's all. We can take it one step at a time. No pressure." For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. She just sat there, her eyes searching his. Mark could see the conflict in her, the pull between wanting to protect herself and wanting to take a chance. He wasn't rushing her, wasn't pushing her. He was just being there, letting her know that she didn't have to face it alone. Finally, Eleanor nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Okay," she said, the words small but meaningful. "I'll try. I don't know how this will go, but I'll try." Mark smiled softly, a warmth spreading through him. It wasn't a promise, but it was a step forward. They weren't there yet, but they were on the same page, at least. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel hopeful. Later that night, after dinner, they sat together in the quiet of the living room. Eleanor was more relaxed now, her shoulders less tense. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them was comfortable, not awkward. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, a silent understanding growing between them. As the night wore on, they both realized that things had changed in a way they hadn't expected. Eleanor wasn't ready to let go of her walls completely, but she was beginning to let Mark inside, and that, Mark realized, was enough for now. Stay tuned for the next part of their story. Will Eleanor continue to open up, or will the past hold her back? As the weeks went by, things between Mark and Eleanor continued to evolve. Slowly, but surely, the walls between them started to crumble. Eleanor was still cautious, still protective of her heart, but she no longer closed herself off completely. She began to share more with Mark, not just about her work, but about her life, her past, her fears. And in turn, Mark shared more of himself too. They began to find comfort in each other's presence, something neither of them had expected when they first entered this arrangement. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony of their home, the city lights sparkling below them, Mark couldn't help but notice how much had changed. The first few weeks had been tense, full of uncertainty, but now it felt different. They were no longer just going through the motions of a business arrangement. There was a quiet connection between them, something that had grown naturally, without either of them realizing it. "You know," Mark said, his voice soft, when I first agreed to this, I never thought it would turn into anything more than a contract. I thought it was just something I had to do for my family, and that would be it. Eleanor looked at him, her expression thoughtful. I thought the same thing, she admitted. But somewhere along the way, it became more than just a deal. I wasn't expecting it, but I started to realize that maybe I didn't want to live my life alone. Maybe I've been pushing people away for too long. Mark reached over and gently took her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Eleanor looked at their hands, then back at him. There was a softness in her eyes, something she hadn't allowed herself to show before. A vulnerability that, until now, had been hidden behind the strong, unshakable facade she had built around herself. Eleanor squeezed his hand lightly, as if testing the waters of trust, something she had been afraid to do for so long. I'm still not sure where this is going, Mark. I don't know if I'm ready to fully let go of all my walls, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see what happens next. Mark smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. That's all I need, Eleanor. One step at a time. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I'm just here, with you, for as long as you want me to be. For the first time, Eleanor smiled in return, a smile that reached her eyes and softened the lines of her face. It wasn't a smile of certainty, but it was a smile of possibility. A smile that said she was open to whatever was ahead, even if she wasn't entirely sure what that was yet. In the weeks that followed, they continued to grow closer. The more Eleanor allowed herself to be vulnerable, the more she realized that there was something real between them. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. They both had their doubts, their fears, but they faced them together, step by step. One afternoon, as they stood together in the garden, watching the sunset behind the city skyline, Mark turned to Eleanor with a look of sincerity in his eyes. You know, he said softly, I'm glad I made the choice to marry you. Not just for the business, but because I got to know you. The real you. And that's something I'll never regret. Eleanor turned to him, her heart beating faster. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. She wasn't afraid to take the leap. I'm glad too, she said quietly, her voice steady. Maybe this was the best mistake we ever made. Mark smiled, his heart full. Maybe it was. And so, as they stood there together, in the fading light of the evening, Mark and Eleanor both realized that the future was uncertain, but for the first time, they weren't facing it alone. They had found something real in each other, something that went beyond the contract they had signed, something that had grown out of trust, vulnerability, and the courage to take a chance. Stay tuned for more of their story. Will they continue to build a future together, or will the shadows of their pasts hold them back? Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much.